Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Shelley Ellis. I'm the director of the ICTR Dissemination and Implementation Launchpad and a visiting professor in the Division of Hematology, Oncology, and Palliative Care here at UW-Madison. This is the Implementation Science Seminar Series. It's a monthly interactive seminar to learn about the four pillars of dissemination and implementation: implementation theory, implementation methods, implementation strategies, and implementation laboratories. Each seminar is held on the second Friday of every month from 12 to 1 p.m. Central Time during this academic year. The seminar is open to all and is a part of the Implementation Science and Community Health Outcomes Certificate Program, which addresses the gap between basic research discoveries and their application in clinical and public health practice. We're delighted that you're here. And I am going to introduce our speaker today. I'm very happy to have Abram Becker here today. He's the Interim Director of Discovery to Product. We call it D2P. It was created through a partnership between UW-Madison and the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. It's focused on innovation, entrepreneurship, and moving university research into real-world impact. He works with faculty, staff, and students across disciplines to help translate ideas and inventions into scalable innovations that can positively impact people and communities. It aligns with commercialization efforts with the Wisconsin idea. Abram brings over 30 years of experience across industry, startups, and academia, with expertise spanning market strategy, translational science, and systems innovation. He has worked with leading life science and healthcare organizations on product development, commercialization, and global strategic planning. Abram received a BS in biology and an MBA with a certificate in health sector management from Duke University and an MS in industrial engineering from UW-Madison, where he focused on health systems engineering and decision science. He's currently pursuing a PhD in clinical investigation here at UW, with research focused on designing translational systems that enhance health equity and real-world impact. We are super excited to have him here today. And before I turn it over to Abram, I just want to give everybody a heads up. Our staff are also planning and hosting an external advisory committee meeting today at 1 p.m. So you might see a couple of us slip out right before that. And I just wanted to let you know that we are not abandoning Abram. We're going to leave him in the hands of Kathy and Molly, but you might see some of us move on. But now I'd like to take this time to turn it over to Abram. And if you have any questions or comments, please put those in the chat and we'll respond during the seminar or as we approach the question and answer period. Abram.
Excellent. Thank you all. Just let me, pull this up quickly and make sure I've got everything set up. Just get a thumbs up. You can see my single screen. Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Shelley and team, for having me today. I'm super excited to share a little bit of the work that I've been doing here at UW, sort of at the intersection of implementation science, commercialization, system engineering, and human-centered design. And again, sort of all with that goal of trying to improve real-world impact. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the why, right? So why are we doing all this? Why am I here? What are we trying to do at D2PB and across the university more broadly, tying it back to the Wisconsin idea? Talk a little bit about sort of the problem, a shared problem that exists across implementation science as well as commercialization or entrepreneurship. Talk a little bit about some of the toolkits from those four disciplinary lenses I talked about, talk about how we can think about integrating them to help increase our ability to have a positive impact on people and communities and society. Share a little bit about, hopefully getting us to the point where we understand some of the shared language, some of the differences and commonalities across the language and frameworks that these approaches use, and then end by talking a little bit about path forward in terms of where we can go with integrating some of these tools and approaches and some resources that exist here in Madison and in our broader ecosystem that are available to help innovators, potential entrepreneurs, basically anyone that's looking to translate their research into impact. So I've spent my career at that intersection of how do we think about taking research, taking ideas, inventions, trying to translate them into real world impact. And I've seen, sort of both the commercial world as well as the academic world work to the same problem, often using different languages. These are just some of the places I've either worked or consulted for or followed as I've sort of winded back and forth from academia into industry, large corporations, startups, in marketing, product development, finance, et cetera. And sorry, I should have mentioned, I've got also have a wife and two boys that are key part of my sort of life and identity. And my wife's actually on faculty here at SMPH in the division of Department of Surgery. She's a surgical oncologist, and we've got two young boys. At UW-Madison, we often talk about the Wisconsin idea, that the boundaries of the university really should be the boundaries of the state, and that all of the great ideas, inventions, knowledge, resources, discoveries need to leave the walls of campus in order to benefit first the citizens of the state of Wisconsin, but over time that's been broadened to the concept of really benefiting people, communities across the nation and across the planet. And what we're trying to do at D2P is help people transform ideas and inventions coming off of campus into innovations that can positively impact those people, those communities, and society, and even the planet writ large. And I think it's critical for us to separate the concept of an invention, a new thing, something that's novel, non-obvious, and potentially useful, from the concept of innovation, which really, in order to have an innovation, you have to translate that idea or invention into something that can create value, that can provide value to a specific group of stakeholders, And in this way, sort of implementation science and commercialization are both trying to get to that point where there's impact. They're trying to do it a little different and taking different lenses. And often within implementation science, we're dealing more in the realm of sort of an idea moving into an innovation that can have an impact, versus often in the commercial world, there may be an invention along the path, something that can be protected, and we can come back to that a little bit later. But in both of these, it's really that ideas and inventions only really become innovations when they're translated, used, adopted, and sustained, And that's really required to have the type of impact that we need and want to have. And then sort of before diving into the difference between implementation science and commercialization, as we've teed up on the talk, I think it's important to bring up this concept of entrepreneurship. One of the sort of pre-reads we shared was from the science-based entrepreneurship education literature, which points out a couple things. One, that science-based entrepreneurial education and really the university's sort of third mission in terms of having a positive impact on society really requires valorization of ideas, inventions into innovations, And to have that positive real world impact, be it commercial or social impact. The other thing that that this literature emphasizes is that entrepreneurship is about more than just commercialization. It also, importantly, is about mindset, And I think as innovators here on campus, I think it fits fully within the concept and the scope of the Wisconsin idea, this lens of how can my research, how can what I'm doing help people, help society? How can I go out and identify problems we're solving, identify opportunities to provide value to keep across various stakeholder groups? How can I, bring creative problem solving, bring these approaches to have that positive impact on the world? And then, sort of which leads us to sort of the title question, right? In terms of thinking about implementation science and commercialization, right? Are they separate? Are they parallel? What, if any, are there overlaps? Right. And in the sort of traditional view, implementation science is driven about evidence and commercialization is driven by market viability. Right. And I'm here today to argue that in many ways, this is a false dichotomy, right? Implementation science may measure success by sustained use and improved outcomes. Commercialization may measure it by market share and profitability. But I think there's opportunity in designing for both, right? And learning from the approach that both are doing. And thinking about the fact that they're both sort of optimized for different failure modes, but that if we solve for the tensions across both, we can get to sort of a better end impact on the people, communities, et cetera, that we're looking to serve. And both fields suffer from the exact same failure mode, and that's the gap between that good idea, between that initial evidence and sustained real world use, right? Sort of the classic valley crossed in the literature, right? That gap from scientific knowledge to socioeconomic impact, that gap from initial discovery, public funding to private funding and broad commercialization. And I'd argue that by applying approaches from both, we can increase the chances that we hurdle that gap or move beyond that cliff. And Proctor et al. Have diagnosed this problem perfectly, pointing out that market viability is a concept that the implementation science community hasn't paid enough attention to, and that sort of in the cold reality, someone has to pay for not just the discovery, design, and development of a new intervention, but someone also has to pay for the adoption, sustainment, scalability, right? And I think this was a great call out by this group. However, I would point out that even in this case, the implementation science literature and community often treats market viability as a single construct when it's actually many. And even within this paper, within a single sentence, they'll say market viability is the concept, and then within that same sentence say it's market demand. No, it's market forces. Actually, it's market risk reward. No, it's actually market relevant. Maybe it's actually market analysis. Maybe it's adoption markets that we need to pay attention to. And again, this isn't criticism. It's just pointing out the fact that that language matters, and that we can dig a bit more into what these concepts from the entrepreneurship literature, from the commercialization and business world mean and how they're applied, and we can bring them across. And before we go forward, I want to acknowledge another hybrid model that predates what I'll show today, and this is another one of the papers that was shared as pre-read. The HIT-ACE method was a structured method to compare health IT options that integrated both academic evidence as well as commercial product information, and introduced elements of competitive analysis from marketing business strategy to implementation science. And I think is a great step along the path of recognizing some of these other tools and frameworks from the commercialization literature, and is sort of a precursor to what I'll be talking about next in terms of how we can more fully integrate some of these four different lenses. However, it didn't fully exploit the viability analysis that Proctor et al. Had talked about, didn't talk about value capture, incentives, market forces, some of these other issues beyond just sort of a more generic concept of market analysis or competitive analysis. And sort of what I'll talk about next is sort of, where this concept that in my brain I'm thinking of as design for impact and sort of how we can move forward from that. And again, sort of what I'm calling design for impact is a simple way to integrate four lenses that already exist across disciplines, but rarely get used together. So desirability, feasibility, implementation and sustainment, and viability, right? And these frameworks bring together logics from different fields, so human-centered design, systems engineering, implementation science, and commercialization. And I'd argue that none of them alone is sufficient, and that if we work to leverage some of the frameworks and tools and contexts from these, and if we leverage them from the beginning, I think we can dramatically increase the likelihood that an idea or invention actually becomes an innovation with real world impact, and one that can scale and be sustained in a way that delivers that impact that we want. And I think this moves beyond the concept of just design for dissemination or design for implementation that already exists, but hopefully is a helpful way to begin addressing some of these gaps that exist in how we're doing things today. And I'd say just quickly before moving on, like here I'm using impact in a broad, plain language sense. So, right, the real world change that we actually care about, whether it's clinical, operational, economic, social, or experiential. The specific metrics vary by field, but the design tensions that are shaping these are consistent. So the first pillar is desirability, right? Does anyone actually want the thing, right? Does it meaningfully solve a real job to be done, right? Is there a real problem that someone cares about, right? And we can go about that using design thinking, right? Human-centered design gives us a disciplined way to do that, to go out to understand needs through empathy, contextual inquiry, problem solving, iterative prototyping with real users, right? And I think that this is a great sounding point and is, where we need and should begin to make sure that we're solving problems that matter to people and that they matter enough that you have the ability to potentially overcome the inertia that you need to do to get change to happen, right? Because, right, change is hard and sustaining change is hard. The second pillar is feasibility, right? And this is, right, does this product or solution fit into the world where people actually work, right? Does the technology work? Does it, and if we think in the systems engineering world, human factors engineering world, the SEEPS model, and here I'm showing SEEPS 2.0, which was developed here at UW-Madison. This gives us a great way to analyze the work system. So the people, the tasks, the tools, the environments, organizational factors, to understand constraints, usability, safety, workflow fit, but also understand how they fit within processes across professional work, right, across patient work, across the collaborative work of all the various stakeholders in the system. And lets us think about outcomes and how do outcomes matter across the different dimensions, patient, professional, organizational, et cetera. And I think, right, this is, another way to point out that even if you have a highly desirable solution, if you don't take into account some of these system feasibility considerations, right, you may still fail, or you still may not have the impact that you're ultimately looking to have. And the third pillar here is implementation and sustainment, right? So can that innovation actually be put into practice and kept into practice? And frameworks like CIFR remind us that context, strategies, readiness, adoption, or adaptation, and long-term sustainment all matter. So even feasible solutions will fail if we don't intentionally design for how they'll be implemented and maintained once the initial grant or excitement wears off. And implementation science toolkit has many frameworks like CIFR that can help us understand and design for context, right? Understanding the inner and outer setting, the individuals, the processes involved. And then sort of the fourth pillar here, and going back to that Proctor prompting and debate paper, is that viability matters. And here, viability is multi-factor, right? Relates to how do you deliver and capture value? What are, right, sort of the moats that allow you to maintain and maintain competitive advantage and exist within the market forces that exist? What are the incentives for the various stakeholders, including the buyers and the payers and the reimbursers, right? How does timing play into this? And I think as I pointed out before, implementation science literature often collapses viability into a single idea, but it really is a multi-factor issue. And sort of as we think about viability, right, and we often think about this within the commercialization or even more narrowly, the entrepreneurship literature, the lean toolkit forces a critical distinction here, where we first must focus on searching for a viable model under conditions of high uncertainty and only then execute and scale. Implementation science and some of these other approaches will often jump directly to execution, or honestly, even within entrepreneurship, right? A common mistake people make is jumping directly to execution before doing the critical work to help explore, identify risk, reduce that risk, and make sure that you're moving forward. And one other point here is that from the outside, as you're looking at this process, it often looks inefficient and unstructured, but it actually increases the likelihood that you're going to downstream be successful. And I think this approach, this lean approach focuses on and points out that, right, an entrepreneur and innovator's job is to identify, manage, reduce risk and uncertainty, and that there's a structured way that you can go about doing this. And this is a very busy slide. I'm not going to read all of these, but I think it's important to step back here and think again about what we mean by entrepreneurship. And it's not just sort of the narrow view that it's someone that starts a company and runs a company and makes money. And going back to the earlier concept around entrepreneurial mindset, I think it's important to think about this as entrepreneurship being defined by people that are willing and incentivized to take risk and to address and manage risk and uncertainty. And it's important here to think about the distinction between risk and uncertainty, where risk is something where we have enough reason or data or evidence or reasoning to support some prior, right? We have a prior probability based on knowledge, experience, versus uncertainty where we just don't know, right? Totally unknown. You might as well flip a coin. You don't have enough insight. And that, sort of as entrepreneurs, you're trying to identify and manage this risk. And then the other concept here is that entrepreneurship is about pursuing opportunity, and I'd argue opportunity to have a positive impact, beyond resources that you control. And from that lens, sort of brings us to another tool within the entrepreneurship and commercialization lens, and that's the business model canvas. And this is a startup tool, but I'm introducing it here more as a risk identification and management tool for research teams. And it's a way to surface desirability, feasibility, and viability risks. Right? The concept of, do people actually want this, right? Can we do it? Can we get it to work within the systems that we're trying to get it to work in? And right at the end of the day, do the dollars and cents make sense? Who's going to pay for it? Why? Are there enough of them out there? And sort of these entrepreneurship frameworks, focus on these three areas, and right, often point out that in order to have a successful innovation, you've got to hit the intersection of that Venn diagram of desirability, feasibility, and viability. And you need to, importantly for us here, think about, how do you not just deliver value, but how do you capture enough of it that you can scale in a sustainable manner? How do you think about different levels of fit? And we'll get to that. How do you think about sort of all of the market forces out there, and how do you take that into consideration as you're designing for viability? And then within sort of this lean launchpad, lean startup approach, we go out and you start with a bunch of guesses. Some of them are educated, some of them are not, but you need a process to figure out how do you turn these into facts, right? And we do that within this lean launchpad approach by applying the scientific methodology to business model development, where we go out, we've got some guesses, hypotheses, we design some tests, we go out, we execute those, we come back, we assess and analyze them, we adjust and pivot, and we do it again. And within sort of this lean launchpad approach, which originated in the Bay Area, so coming out of Berkeley and Stanford, and then has been adopted by the National Science Foundation in their I-Corps program, as well as NCI had their own version of the I-Corps, actually out of I-Corps at NCATS for a while. And here at UW-Madison, we're part of the NSF I-Corps hub, Great Lakes region, and some of the programs that we've run here at D2P, our Innovation to Market and Igniter programs, are also based on this lean launchpad approach. And sort of at its foundation, we're based on three main things. So one, this business model canvas as a couple things. One, a shared language. Two, a process to help facilitate iteration, and a way to identify and manage risk across these three key buckets of feasibility, desirability, and viability. Next is this customer discovery process to go out and collect data about various hypotheses related to your business model and as they relate to desirability, feasibility, and viability. And lastly, sort of bringing an agile methodology coming out of the software development industry and applying that to business model development or to design, development, and scaling of or dissemination and implementation of new innovations, new products and services that can hopefully have a positive impact here. But I think this is a good point to switch and broaden it, that, in the commercialization literature, in the entrepreneurship literature, we talk often about customer segments, customer types, and within the implementation, if we broaden it to implementation science world, if we think about public and population health, I think it's helpful to think not just of customers, but of stakeholders, and not just of types or segments, but of roles. And I think it's important to recognize that the end user may be different than the beneficiary, who may be different from the decision maker, may be different from the payer or reimburser. right? And there often are different people that are influencing or recommending a given product or service or intervention, right? And I think keeping these things in mind as we're designing is important, because if we just take a narrow user-centered design approach, and again, not that it's narrow, but if we take only a user-centered design approach or human-centered design approach, we can miss some of these other roles that are important, right? That if we think about what some of the systems engineering approaches, if we think about what the implementation science approaches, if we think about what entrepreneurship and commercialization approaches bring us, we're more likely to hit on and overcome some of the barriers to adoption and successful implementation and sustainment. Now, within sort of this lean startup framing, we often think about three levels of fit. So the first is this concept of problem solution fit, which, sort of the desirability lens helps us address, right? And that's right, making sure that we are addressing problems that people care about. The next level up is this concept of product market fit, right? Evidence that customers or stakeholders actually care about your specific value proposition that you're delivering to them. And above this, and this is where viability comes in, is right business model fit, evidence that your business model delivers value and delivers value within the ecosystem or environment in which it's living, and that can be sustained over time. I think these two lenses, and again, this is out of the Proctor paper, but if we think about implementation science and entrepreneurship, right, they don't have to be adversaries here. They're just optimized for different decisions. And if we think about sort of a shared language here, we can think about how do we leverage and collaborate and think about complementary approaches here, where market demand isn't a bad thing, right? And understanding that market forces exist, and understanding that if a given intervention is going to be developed, disseminated, and implemented by a commercial player, then profitability matters. Even if it's going to be implemented, disseminated, and implemented by a purveyor, right? Sustainability still matters, right? And understanding elements of return and process and market size, et cetera, still matter. And then again, this is a bit busy, but diving in a little bit more here, right? I think that there are a number of key questions that come from an entrepreneurial perspective that can help us as implementation scientists address these market viability questions, right? And in addition to the Proctor paper here, I put a recent paper out of the social administrative pharmacy lens, where again, which ties back to what I've been sharing, this concept of broaden the frame to think about how can we create value? How can we create value for the relevant stakeholders, right? And also think about it, how can that value proposition deliver value that can be captured, and how can that help us think about sustainment across the various levels of the systems that we're trying to impact. Bringing it back to implementation science, I think, right, again, implementation science has great frameworks, tools to help us think about value, right? So value doesn't just exist within the context of dollars and cents to a for-profit company or dollars and cents to a customer. Here, a paper from a couple of years ago points out that we can think about value in a system context, in an organizational context, in a provider or patient context, and think about how we can tease out how elements of the intervention and how it is adapted, uh, apply, uh, and how that interacts with the context of the system, of the organizational, of the provider, of the payer, and how implementation strategies can help optimize value delivery across those contexts for those innovations. And then wanted to point out that this actually isn't a one-way street. This isn't just about implementation science learning from commercialization. And in fact, the commercialization world is now leveraging, adopting implementation science frameworks to increase their potential to have a positive impact, their potential to reach, scalable impact, profitable impact for their solutions. And I threw up just a handful of examples from the commercial world, from some vendors that are out there selling and promoting these approaches to the biotech and pharmaceutical industry, the life sciences industry. And I'd say importantly, right, like this applies across the translational research spectrum from right early, preclinical work, right, through clinical development, regulatory approval, market access, widespread adoption. Again, there are ways that the implementation science approach can help not just sort of folks within the mission aligned nonprofit world that are trying to have a positive impact on public and population health, but that these approaches can help the commercial world as well. And then I'd say, right, there are, and we shared sort of this squiggly path before, right, that, and I'll share, right, the path to impact is almost never a straight line. And there are many failure points along the path. So even with user-centered design, implementation science, adoption can collapse if you don't take into consideration sort of these broader desirability, feasibility, implementation and sustainment and viability constructs. I'll use just one example here from the literature. So there was a user-centered clinical decision support tool that had been developed, focused on upper respiratory infection, had been developed with a co-design, user-centered design approach. In the initial study showed 68% utilization in the original trial site, right? High sort of acceptability, right? Positive enough. They move forward sort of to do an implementation study and used sort of adapted, used a process to adapt the intervention to new sites, studied it in 33 sites across 2 health systems. And at the 6-month mark, utilization fell to the 17% mark in the first health system and the 5% at the in the second system, right, and continued declining to the 12-month mark. And what failed here wasn't the evidence, it wasn't the design process. It just was that it didn't address some of the deeper issues of desirability, feasibility, and viability, right? So didn't address some of the issues of workflow burden and how sort of integrating into a different work system was going to change the world. Didn't address some of the areas of alert fatigue. Didn't address some of the areas of, right, sort of the perceived value and how they differ across things. And again, this is sort of the lens that I'm hoping if we bring this integrated design for impact lens and from the beginning, think about all of these pillars, we can hopefully work to reduce the risk of hitting these various failure points. And again, so with that, right, sort of last couple slides here, sort of hopefully the key takeaways here is that if we want to maximize impact, right, we need to be thinking across these four lenses, right? And if we think about not just desirability, feasibility, implementation, and sustainment, if we bring in viability as well, we can increase the likelihood that not only do we have impact in narrow, controlled initial studies, but that we can actually have broader, scalable, sustainable impact across populations. Implementation science and commercialization, right, can work together and are working together. And I think there are opportunities to do more. And right, if we think across these frames, we can identify risk that some of the more narrow disciplinary lenses may miss. That there's opportunity to increase, right, translation across scientists, engineers, clinicians, innovators, right, the business world as well. And that, right, success and impact requires more than just ideas, more than just inventions, right? We need to increase and improve our translational science methods. And I think that there's lots of opportunity to do this, to design for impact, not just publications, not just prototypes. And then lastly here, just want to talk about, there are lots of organizations here on campus and in our ecosystem that are available to help innovators, potential entrepreneurs, actual entrepreneurs. So they include Discovery to Product, they include ICTR and the ICTR D&I Launchpad, they include the ISMUS project within SMPH and UW Health. They include sort of the Technology Entrepreneurship Office, which runs, manages campuses' involvement in the NSF I-Corps program. They include Forward Biolabs and many. And again, I'm not going to go into all of them here, but I will say, sort of we at D2P and within sort of the network are more than happy to help you think through when and how to leverage all of these great organizations and the people in them that are here wanting and desiring and able to help you as innovators, as researchers. One of the ways that we try to pull some of these together right now is via the Innovate Network. You can go to innovate.wisc.edu. We've got information on some of these resources that are available for you here, have information about events and tools, resources, some funding sources, etc. So encourage you to check that out. We send out a monthly Innovate Insider newsletter that may be helpful for you. And then lastly, I just do want to also point out that the Chancellor has identified entrepreneurship as an opportunity area for campus to provide more resources to help further the Wisconsin idea. And just this summer, it was announced that UW Madison is launching a new Wisconsin Entrepreneurship Hub, again, to help further the Wisconsin idea, to help accelerate entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurial mindset across campus. And we at D2P are, right, sort of in process of evolving and aligning with this new campus strategy, and just say more to come on this front. But again, I'd say exciting that campus is looking to lean more, even more into this, especially if we broaden up and think about some of the broader concepts that I was chatting about today. And that, sort of thank you so much. Tried to keep this to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, and I'll just end by saying, right, at least in my view, right, hopefully I convinced you that if we think about design for impact, right? Just something that's simply about the Wisconsin idea, helping operationalize the Wisconsin idea, aligning evidence, design, systems, and market so that good ideas can become real world change. So with that, thank you, and happy to answer some questions.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Abram. This has been really thought-provoking for me, and I've got a couple of questions, and I know Molly's going to have some other questions too. But one of the things I always tell people when they come to us to, present their evidence-based practice or the intervention that they've created, I say, it's so much easy. We can never implement something faster than when you're solving a problem that somebody has. And so your ideas about viability are sort of bringing that in the different levels of fit of the intervention to different levels. And then the other thing you talked about was desirability. And that really struck me because we commonly, across all kinds of interventions, measure feasibility, acceptability, and appropriateness. And it's just, those three things are what we're measuring. But now as you're talking, I'm like, that bar is so low. We need to be measuring desirability. And I think that's definitely something that we're missing in implementation science. Do you have any suggestions for instruments or, tools to measure desirability from your field that we might be able to borrow in implementation science?
Um, First, thank you for that and for the comments and the question. So there, I think you are right that it going beyond acceptability and appropriateness is important. And so there are some different tools that are used sort of within the marketing and product development world that try to get at desirability from a couple different frames, right? And some of it is right that I think people are already doing, which is just right qualitative in-depth interviews and focus group interviews, sort of think out loud types of studies, again, that you can use from design studies or systems and human factors engineering. But there are also some things where sort of in the marketing research literature where you just ask, put in front of people a concept and then say, would you use this or not? But I think it's important to going back to the concepts of these things exist in a competitive context and in an environment. So you can't just ask in isolation, is this desirable or useful, right? As much as possible, you need to get them into a mindset where they're making a decision that they would actually make, right? So you need to put forward the appropriate, right, consideration set. You need to put forward the amount of evidence or information that they would have when they're actually making the decision, right? And there are some different kind of tools that you can do, sort of where you can do that, and it depends on the point in the process that you're doing it, right? So there are like conjoint based studies and choice based things where you can do it if you're trying to figure out and optimize the features and how they tie to benefits. There are ways you can do that if you're thinking about how do you optimize your positioning and messaging of that. But then there are also ways that you can do it just to figure out, is this even something that people care about? And I'd say another lens here that goes back to that ties desirability into viability is that there are lots of things from the pricing market research literature that address, right, how you ask about pricing and cost matters, right? And if you ask someone like, what would you pay versus what do you expect to pay versus like what's the maximum you'd pay versus right, where is this so cheap that you think it's not, that you question its value versus like where is it too expensive that it, right? And again, I won't go into all of them, but there are a bunch of different ways that how you ask the question really influences the value of the data that you get out of it. And then I'll also say at the end of the day, right, people also do some combination of lying or tell you what you want to hear. So, right, you need to be thoughtful about doing this research in a way that hopefully reduces the bias as much as possible. And the last point I'll make there is that going back to those levels of fit and within the lean launchpad approach, you shouldn't transition fully into execution mode, and you don't really know if you have product market fit until you actually sell something to someone, right? And then until you can actually do it again and again, right? Until you can get to that point that you can show that you have a value proposition that more than one person wants, and that you can do it and scale it in a sustainable manner, right? And so I don't know if that fully answers your question, but right, those are some of the initial thoughts.
Mm-hmm. No, that it does answer it, and it brings up some other ideas, which are, I appreciate your comment about, getting rid of bias. Like people will tell you what you want to hear, and I worry about that when we rely a lot on qualitative research. And then your comment about, you never know until it's actually in the market, if it's marketable, right? And so is simulation ever a sort of methodology that you might use to see if people would pick up this product? Or, I don't know how, we have simulation labs in the hospital and health systems, and I don't know if that's a way to just see if that's something that's useful to people.
Yeah. So simulation can mean different things. Uh, but the short answer is yes. And right, so there, um, right, you can put things in front of people again, right? Simulated decision choice, right? And those can be, right, just literally you're still using a software program and saying, I would do this in this situation or this and that, right? You could put people, right, even do, right, simulated data, put them in front of people, say, what decision would you make here, right? And if you're thinking about a new clinical decision support tool, or if you're thinking about, right, evaluating a new predictive model, et cetera, right? You can do things in a simulated environment before you actually roll it out and test it for real world um, uh, effectiveness and efficacy and effectiveness. But then also, if we broaden this, and I think one of my D2P colleagues is on here, but if we think about test markets, right, like you can actually, in the food world, right, you can set up right, a test environment where you have someone rolling through like sort of a fake or a real store and see what do they buy, right? So, and that is another way. And then again, within that world, sort of the next step is you can move beyond simulation where you do things in smaller controlled studies before you roll them out broadly as well. So, and again, I guess that's a little bit different than, right, some of the, right, simulation models I would think about from like systems engineering or computer science approach, which is
Mm.
probably a different context.
It looks like there's some good questions in the chat. If folks want to come off of mute and ask their own question, but I'll start with Anand's question. He's praising your talk. He wonders if there are any examples of products or innovations that you've worked with that really took off quickly that offer key lessons for researchers.
Wow. That's a good one. And, like, interestingly, many things that are popping to mind are more failures than successes, right? And in some cases, right, like sort of failures, you can learn maybe more from failures than from successes. But, and again, not to maybe give too much identification publicly to some of these things, right? Like lots of examples where if you don't get one of these lenses or two of these lenses right, like you're just not going to get widespread adoption and things will fail. Or where if you don't meet a sort of key threshold, potential influencers and recommenders turn into saboteurs because you haven't met the performance requirements, or you haven't met, right? Like there's desirability. Yes, there's a problem to be solved, but if you don't meet the performance requirements, right, or if you're not competitive with what's out there today, you may fail. And I think, another thing that comes to mind about those that have worked is it's important to think about, right, what's the evidence needed to get someone to consider adopting and trialing your product. What are the, right, sort of within the marketing world, we think about positioning, and we think about what are the reasons to believe that positioning, right? And from a right, sort of a population health, a public health, right, sort of medical perspective, right? It's like, how do you create an evidence generation strategy in order to convince the relevant stakeholders, right? And I'd say one of the things that folks, especially even in the commercial world, miss many times, especially in sort of, if you think about diagnostics or medical devices, is that people will often mistakenly think that, right, the final hurdle is FDA clearance or approval, but they don't recognize that in many cases that's just right, that's just the next hurdle, but that does not guarantee reimbursement. That does not guarantee that anyone's going to pay you for this. That doesn't clear, right, being able to deliver the health economic story that you need to tell for payers, right? That doesn't. So, right, again, if you're not thinking from those lenses and thinking about those lenses from the beginning, because you got to raise money to do all this. And if you are only raising money to the point where you can start selling the product or service, but you don't recognize the gap in time and what's going to be required to build that evidence generation strategy to get to the point where people are going to you're actually going to get that uptake, because suddenly systems are incentivized to use your product or service or your intervention or your innovation because they're getting paid for it, instead of you're just saying, trust me, it makes sense. And oh, by the way, maybe you'll get paid for it someday. Thank
you so much, Abram. I want to call attention to Paula's comment in the chat, pointing out that there's a lot of desirability tools that come from design thinking and market research world, and her willingness to chat more. I know that that's of interest to a lot of folks who we do consultations with or work with on E2Is at the Launchpad. We have more questions for Abram. I'm sure all of us have many more. So I would encourage you to reach out directly to Abram with those and to the D2P group. Thank you so much for your talk and your time. And this has been a super interesting angle on D&I work. So appreciate it. For those attending, we will send you, there's a link in the chat, or we'll follow up in email with a feedback survey. It's super helpful to us if you can fill those out, and you'll get a reminder email. And then our next seminar is on December 12th. So I hope you join us all. You all join us for that. And again, thank you so much, Abram. Excellent talk. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.